Yes, recently graduated from KU, and very happy to be back here. And I would like to add that not only did I get my Ph.D. at the School of Economics, at the Department of Economics, but I also attended the Antitrust Law here at the law school, and that was a big component in me writing out my dissertation and where I am right now. So I definitely encourage everyone, all the law students, to take that class. All right, so what I'm going to talk today is paradigm shifts on merger efficiencies in antitrust analysis. And perhaps you might think that that's not as well fitting for this particular symposium, since we're talking about the 21st century, and I'm actually going to take you on a little history travel. But I still think that it is important for us to understand where we are in the context of where we were. So don't worry, I'm not going to bore you too much with some history lessons, but first I would like to use my necessary disclaimer that the opinions and the bills that are going to be expressed here are my own and not that of Economists Incorporated. And I would like to start out with this little word cloud. And this is the result of some text mining that I did. So basically I picked up the most common merger cases that we cite over and over whenever we're talking about efficiencies, whenever we're talking about where antitrust law is and how we got to the point that we are, and looking at what are the most common words that are cited, that are used in these cases. And as you can probably guess, the size of the word is proportional to how often, the frequency that they're used on those merger cases. The biggest one for sure is market, and we can understand, well, everything kind of revolves around that market definition, right? So if we go to Section 7 of the Clayton Act, we need to show that there is lessening of competition. In any line of commerce, we have our product market definition in any region of the country, so we have our geographic market definition. Price is naturally very important. This is kind of our go-to measure of are we harming consumers, are we not? Is this going to be anti-competitive, so on and so forth. We have the idea of competition. And then at some point in my presentation, I would like to get what is this competition thing that we're trying to protect, right? It seems like it's such a clear-cut definition, and yet we keep going around on what it is we're trying to protect. So we have things such as evidence, merger, the products, distribution, but I would like to point out that one of the ones that really made the cut was the word efficiencies, right? Notice that doesn't necessarily mean that the agencies have been looking favorably historically towards efficiencies, but it does mean that it is a topic of conversation, of discussion that keeps coming out over and over. Sorry, going the opposite direction. So, a little bit of an introduction after my word cloud is efficiencies are commonly used as defenses in antitrust merger processes. It's very common to hear. We are merging because we're becoming more efficient, and this is good for society. Williamson in 1968 shows that it is possible that consolidation in the presence of efficiencies may improve total welfare. And then the key thing here is total welfare, right? The effects for consumers themselves and the effect for society tends to be ambiguous. Everything is going to depend on magnitude, everything is going to depend on pass-through and things like that. But historically, even though this dates back from 1968, there has been full of skepticism and volatility in terms of acceptance in merger review. So, showing a little bit what Williamson was trying to make his point is, suppose I have a market, there are only two firms, but for some reason they're competitive enough that I'm driving it to the perfectly competitive outcome, right? So I have my point in here in which my demand intercepts my marginal cost, and I have the price pre-merger, and it's given in this way, right? What is total welfare? Is 100%. What is consumer welfare? Is as high as can be, right? Okay. Suppose then that those two firms merge, but they also become more efficient. So notice that there are two things happening at the same time, right? The first thing is, well, if I become more efficient, then this marginal cost, which used to be the place in which I would find my intersection, is now going to drop. This isn't necessarily going to be welfare increasing, at least in this sense of change. But on the other hand, now the two firms, they used to be very competitive and driven the market to the perfectly competitive outcome, now have enough market power that they can raise prices above this competitive level. So we find a new point of intersection here, in which my marginal revenue is going to be intersecting with my new marginal cost. I can now project that into my demand function, and I find a price post-merger that is higher than the price pre-merger. Okay, so far we just went to what was one equilibrium, what was the other one. Let's see who's benefited, who's harmed in this whole transaction, right? So notice that this was the consumer surplus that we started with, right? Everything underneath the demand function and above my price is welfare for consumers. So what happens with welfare for consumers afterwards? Well, they're harmed, right? I lost some of what used to be consumer welfare and now no longer is. And this is the amount of consumer welfare that was lost. However, part of this loss of welfare is being transferred to the firms. But we also have something that now is welfare that didn't used to be before, right? Which is our cost efficiencies. So what the society gain by now being able to produce the exact same thing at a lower cost? Well, then this, we can account that this upper triangle over there is the deadweight loss. So that is what society as a whole lost due to this consolidation. On the other hand, you have this rectangle here that shows what didn't used to be welfare but now is, and technically, as long as this rectangle is bigger than this triangle, then we have something that is beneficial for society. And society here is going to be defined as total welfare. When I'm talking about consumers, we're talking about the total, right? So it is possible for us to see that a merger that can harm consumers could still be beneficial for society if we define them in terms of those different welfares. So this is exactly the point that Williamson was bringing, is that perhaps we should be taking a look at efficiencies from a bigger picture instead of just being skeptical. So, which brings us to, this is the standard we're using in the United States. It's the Consumer Welfare Standard. And that goes to the very key question of what are the goals of antitrust, right? We say, yes, antitrust is trying to protect competition, which is much less clear than it seems, right? When I was teaching industrial organization and antitrust policy in the economics department, I used to tell my students that competition is the ability of two firms that are equally efficient to compete in the same market should they want to. But that's not necessarily what Consumer Welfare Standard is trying to get to, right? The goal of antitrust then became, okay, I can show harm as long as the consumers are the ones who are harmed. They're the part that has to be protected. And as a matter of fact, if we take a trip around the world, most countries do indeed follow the Consumer Welfare Standard, but we have also clear examples of countries that follow a total welfare standard perspective, more notably Canada and New Zealand. But if the emphasis is then given on consumer welfare, then I don't need to just show efficiencies that are enough to augment total welfare. I need those efficiencies must be high enough to revert whatever potential price increase there would have been in the presence of a merger. And that is a much higher threshold to reach, and it's a lot harder to prove. So if we look at the early days of merger review, some of those cases have already been cited by my fellow colleagues presenting here today. But we have Brown Shoe, Philadelphia National Bank, Procter & Gamble. The U.S. Supreme Court technically never repealed the decision not to accept merger efficiencies as an antitrust defense, but that is kind of also due to the fact that no merger case has been up to the U.S. Supreme Court since the 60s, right? We also have, around the same time, the first merger guidelines in 1968, saying that economies aren't to be taken under consideration unless there are exceptional circumstances. So if we read between the lines of a lot of what was being said in the 60s is we're actually afraid of efficiencies, because efficiencies can make bigger companies more powerful, and then they can run out the small competitors from the market. So there is this notion, at least in this point in time, that the role, the goal and the objective of antitrust in terms of protecting competition kind of means protecting competitors, right? Or at least the possibility that we can have a certain number of competitors within the market. So doing a little bit of that text mining that I was talking about, we can see how often those terms have been mentioned in those different cases. So we see market share as being market share and concentration, our first two in here, being taken like a predominant role in how those cases were being decided and what was the concern that was being talked about. We see a little bit of entry and barriers being a little bit of a concern, but then we see the increasing worry about efficiencies, especially on the Procter & Gamble, in which there was the precedent set that efficiencies cannot be taken to reboot an anti-competitive prima facie case that has already been shown. Some important milestones that happened since then. We have the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act in 1976, which made such that merger review became a lot more prophylactic. So if two parties would like to merge, they have to let the antitrust agencies know beforehand if they reach, if they are above a certain threshold of the value of the deal itself. So now we have to become, it creates this necessity for us to establish ex ante, so before the merger actually happens, whether it's going to harm consumers, right? So notice what I'm saying here is that I have to show efficiencies if that is going to be accepted as a defense before those efficiencies are actually allowed to be formalized. So I'm trying to estimate something that has actually never happened, right? And you also have the second and third merger guidelines kind of back to back in 1982 and 1984. 1984 just kind of gave a little bit more details and explanations about the things that were said in 82. And we see that the primary benefit of mergers to the economies is their efficiency enhancing potential, which can increase the competitiveness of firms and result in lower prices to consumers. But it also says that we will reject claims of efficiencies if equivalent or comparable savings can reasonably be achieved by the parties through other means. So we're starting to point here the idea that, yes, I could take merger efficiencies under consideration as long as they're merger specific, right? The next step for this is that they're also going to have to be verifiable. So I have to show this in at least a quantitative manner that those merger efficiencies can actually be played out. But it also have to show that those efficiencies could not be achieved but for this transaction, or at least on any other means that are going to be yet more restrictive than the merger itself. We have University Health in 1991 saying that significant mergers generated efficiencies if substantiated, who result in a rebuttal of a prima facie case of illegality, which kind of goes exactly on the flip side of what we see in Procter & Gamble in 1967. We have also the birth of our Mortar Guidelines in 1992. This was the first one that was focused exclusively on horizontal mergers, and was also the first joint guidelines by the agency, so both by the Federal Trade Commission and the U.S. Department of Justice. And we see that, yes, we're getting closer and closer to understanding what this merger efficiency thing is all about. So they have found that certain types of efficiencies are more likely to be cognizable and substantial than others. So notice that, yes, we're taking inefficiencies under consideration, but we think we went too far off the deep end on the 80s and considering all types of efficiencies. And now perhaps we need to give this a little bit more structure and see what it is that we're talking about. And citing favorably, shifting production among facilities formerly owned separately, which enable the merging firms to reduce the marginal cost of production. So we see a very clear economic framework for the types of efficiencies that the agencies are starting to take under consideration. Doing sort of the same thing, we see again on the very top, efficiencies being the hottest topic that the agencies are going to be looking at. We also see kind of the birth of the HHI on the earlier cases. Yes, we were concerned about concentration, but it was a lot more common to use a 4-firm concentration ratio or an X-firm concentration ratio, right? So essentially, I look at who are the biggest firms in the market, what are their market shares, and do a simple sum of those, and see whether this is increasing concentration in a sense. We also see the rise of the word definition, and I'm going to show later a different slide, but this is actually coming from the importance of market definition and seeing how sensitive those measures of concentration were starting to be to this part that is essential to merger review in a sense, which is to establish a market definition, but also makes it so dependent on it. So we finally get to our latest and greatest horizontal merger guidelines of 2010, and we see that the agency's efficiencies considerations says that competition usually spurs firm to achieve efficiencies internally. So what this is saying is, yes, and even in the absence of some consolidation, it is possible that the incentives that are being created in the market in and of itself of firms trying to compete with one another could be the very element that is generating efficiencies. However, or nevertheless, a primary benefit of mergers to the economy is their potential to generate significant efficiencies, and thus enhance the merged firm's ability and incentive to compete, which may result in lower prices, improved quality, enhanced service, or new products. Notice that they are also opening up this idea that efficiencies need not to be tied exclusively to some reduction in marginal cost, right? I could be talking about efficiencies in my sense, in the sense of, well, now they're going to be a lot more likely and a lot more capable of generating innovation through research and development, or it could be that the quality itself is going to be enhanced, and perhaps this could fall under the umbrella of an efficiency definition. Kind of the latest case post-2000, most of those are actually post the 2010. The only one that kind of is a little far off in here is H&R Block. That is a little older. But we have Oracle, Aetna, Humana, and Cisco, and you still see a lot of market share being played into those market into this merger analysis. You see that HHI still occupies a significant role in determining, at least to some extent, what are the risks that these mergers are being brought. But you also see efficiency occupying a very prominent place in all of those. So, last but not least, at least in this part, that I did with text mining was to say, okay, first I created the word cloud by seeing which were the words that were most commonly cited or most commonly appeared in all of those cases. And then I shifted to doing bigrams and saying, okay, what are the couple of words that are most commonly used? And then I can see what are the associations that are happening within those cases. So as we would expect, the most common used words are also going to be the words that are going to be directionally on bigram, being able to be the center of those networks, right? So right in the middle of this biggest network, we have market, which was also the biggest word that we found on our word cloud. We see important things such as expert testimony being played out here, switching data, which is one of the key ways in which we measure diversion, which was also mentioned here before. We see effects being probable, anti-competitive effect. We see coordinated, unilateral, all the types of concerns, anti-competitive concerns that are raised. But we also find right here that significant efficiencies defense is one of the most common associated bigrams exactly in this direction that are used in those merger cases. But we could say, okay, suppose we would like to see the merger review under the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, and we go through this through time. So our bars are the pre-merger notifications, and they're on the x-axis on your left. Yes, on your left. And we see the actual Hart-Scott-Rodino's investigated, initiated, given by your line, and their y-axis is on the right. And we see that there is an extreme disparity between the number of those mergers that are actually being investigated and the ones that are just being notified to the agencies. And we can say, maybe we're just not investigating enough, you know? Maybe this whole thing of efficiencies defense is putting yet another issue on something that it sounds like the agencies are already being pretty lenient. So why should I go through the trouble of trying to estimate ex ante what those efficiencies if we're already not investigating enough? Well, that's why I come to investigating, okay, how does HHI perform in the presence of efficiencies? And this kind of branched out to another paper of mine in which I examine what are the effects of, what is the quality of using upward pricing pressure in the presence of efficiencies. So to kind of give you a little bit of a background on what it is that we're going to be doing is, okay, if you're not familiar with HHI, I apologize that I waited this long to actually go through it, but basically you're going to take the market share for each of the firms, you're going to square it, and aggregate over every firm in the market. This has a number of benefits over the 4-firm concentration ratio that was used in the early days, in the early cases of antitrust. Because suppose you have a 4-firm concentration ratio of 100, you don't know if that's a monopoly, you don't know if that's a market with 4 firms of 25% market share each, right? And what the Hartford-Hirschman index does is it kind of includes a penalizing way of the greater you are, the more asymmetric the market is going to be, then the higher the HHI is also going to be. Miller and others in 2017, they test the accuracy of the Hartford-Hirschman index as a merger screening tool, and their conclusion is that HHI can still, in many cases, be a good indicator of whether mergers should be investigated or not. But a key thing is that they do not test the presence of merger efficiencies. So the natural question to answer is, okay, how about in the presence of efficiencies? How well does HHI even do? In microeconomics, companies had to present economies of scope. If I look at their total cost function, the total cost function of producing both goods X and good Y is smaller than the cost of producing good X separately from good Y. So this is essentially the framework that we're using. In antitrust cases, as we said previously, efficiencies ought to be merger-specific and verifiable. It definitely is merger-specific because these efficiencies cannot be realized absent of the merger. They can only be realized if both goods are being produced under the same production function, so under the same decision agency, decision agent, sorry. And it is verifiable in the sense that it just provided me with a quantitative tool to actually see whether those things are happening or not. So we're going to do something that's called a Monte Carlo simulation, and And essentially, I'm going to create various worlds in which, or actually various markets, in which firms are competing beforehand. Two of those decide to merge, they consolidate, and then I can calculate what is going to be the post-merger equilibrium. To do so, I follow a very similar methodology than the one used on my earlier paper joint with Dr. Sabarol, in which we use four demand systems that are commonly used in merger review, so logit, linear, log linear, and almost ideal. We're also testing two different ways in which this merger efficiencies could be playing out, and they all fulfill that need to be merger specific and verifiable, and those are functional forms of generalized neo-T and quadratic. I'm also offering you three different market structures, so we could start out with 4 firms, 6 firms, or 8, and this generates 24 scenarios, 3,000 draws of data for each of them. So the simulation steps. Basically, this is the same process for 4, 6, and 8 firms. The market shares, the margin, and efficiencies are randomly drawn. We calibrate a logit demand system in the pre-merger equilibrium. We calibrate the remaining demand systems based out of such that they're comparable with the logit elasticities. In each of the draw, 2 of those firms are going to be allowed to merge. The post-merger equilibrium prices are computed, as well as the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. We repeat these steps until 3,000 draws of data are obtained. So a little bit of summary statistics. If we start out with 4 firms, then notice that if I look at my market concentration pre-merger, this is at 1976, and our post-merger, the median is 2706. So essentially, if you look at the horizontal merger guidelines, I start out with a market that was moderately concentrated, and I ended up with a market that was highly concentrated, at least at the median. We see that with generalized neo-T cost structures, due to efficiencies, a lot of those prices actually went down after the merger, whereas with the quadratic, the efficiencies are a little bit more tamed, and we still ended up with positive price increases after the merger. With 6 firms, we start out with 1569 and until 1925 in terms of market concentration. So essentially, is a market that started out as moderately concentrated and ended up moderately concentrated. So there's no change in category in this sense. Whereas for our 8 firms, we start out with a market that is unconcentrated, and then it goes to moderately concentrated after this merger has happened. So in terms of merger screening with HHI, if you look at the guidelines, you can basically separate any potential merger into 5 categories. Category number 1 would be that the post-HHI is above 2,500, and the change in HHI due to the merger is of 200. Then we can kind of go down from there, looking at the different thresholds. And the guidelines do not say if you find yourself in category 1, we're definitely going to investigate you. But basically, if you go down the categories, there's a decreasing chance that your merger case is going to be investigated. So if we look at the different category screens and the frequency of a 5% price increase, I'd like to take a minute to point out that the horizontal merger guidelines do not say how much of a price increase is too much, even though they do say how much they do give thresholds for concentration based on HHI. So since we use for market definition on the small but significant non-transitory increase in price, and this threshold is of 5%, this is the 5% that I'm using here. So we see that if I find myself in category 1, in which I have a generalized neo-T cost structure and a logit, I have a 30% chance that this merger is going to generate a price increase of at least 5%. And this ranges from 30% to all the way to 58%. If you find yourself in categories 1, 2, and 3, or 1, 2, or 3, this goes from 20% all the way to just about 55. And we can say, okay, how about a quadratic cost structure? This goes from 61 to a 90%. So at least seems like in some cases, looking at a category for HHI seems to suggest that price increases are actually going to happen. It depends on the nature of those efficiencies that are going to be realized or not. But suppose that I would like to plot this and see what this looks like. So on my y-axis, I have what my true post-merger price is. Our pre-merger prices are normalized to 1. So if you see a 1.05, this is both a 5% increase and a 5-cent increase in price, right? And on my x-axis, I have the change in HHI. So this is basically the delta 2 times the product of those market shares. And we would like to see, at least for something that I'm using, I'm actually concerned about market power, right? But I use market concentration as a proxy for that. So if I'm using something as a proxy, I would like to, at the very least, see something that looks like a linear relationship, right? So I would like to see these points distributed around those 2 quadrants right here. But what I see instead is that there doesn't seem to be at least a very natural relationship between looking at the changes in concentration and the changes in price, in the presence of those efficiencies. So what if we establish what the thresholds are? Suppose I picked up what is my threshold for category 1, which is my change in 200 for the HHI. So I am basically investigating all of those mergers that fall with an HHI, a change in HHI greater than 200. And for those that are underneath, then perhaps I don't think that those are going to be anti-competitive anyway, so I'm not going to be investigating. Notice that what I would actually like to investigate are all the mergers that fall themselves above this 1.05 line. But I cannot observe that, because I am talking about what the post-merger prices are going to be once the merger actually happens. But the one thing I can do is perform a market definition and calculate market concentration and look at what these increases are going to be. So this basically generates 2 types of problems, right? Suppose that instead of me doing a merger screening, I would like to find out a test of whether I have cancer. I would like my test to do 2 things. I would like it to show that I have cancer if I actually have cancer, and I would like for it to not show that I have cancer if I do not have cancer. So since with this case is actually a very similar thing, right? I could say that this merger could potentially generate anti-competitive effects when it does, not show that it's going to generate anti-competitive effects when it doesn't, or any combination of those, which basically gives me both false positives and false negatives, right? So if I find myself in this lower quadrant here, those are all the mergers that have been flagged, but they have not generated significant anti-competitive effects. So this is a waste of time and resources from the part of the agencies. On the other hand, the ones that find themselves in this off quadrant here generate a very different type of problem, because those are the false negatives. Those are the ones that the agencies decided not to pursue, not to investigate, but they actually were harmful to consumers through a price increase. So yes, perhaps we are not investigating as many as we'd like, but my point with this is we're investigating the wrong ones. So if we actually would like to track sorry, I don't think this is showing what I wanted to show. Okay. My bad, I lost the slide. I actually had a type 1, type 2 error type of situation, but it's okay. Basically, our type 1 and type 2 errors are both large enough if you use an HHI as a merger screening tool. And just to show the other combinations, since I told you that I had so many different scenarios, is we don't actually see a linear relationship on any of them. So the conclusion is, antitrust policy historically has been non-linear with regards to efficiencies in merger review. We went from being extremely scared of efficiencies because this was going to drive away our small competitors and we would like to keep them in. It went to, in the 80s and 90s, to being extremely lenient and saying, okay, if you have efficiencies, then this is what antitrust is all about. As long as I'm not harming consumers, we're good. And now we're in the process of like, okay, maybe we should be careful with this. We definitely would like to include some merger efficiencies arguments, but we would like to get this to be as cautious and as anchored in economic theory and the antitrust policy as possible. And whether those efficiencies are actually included in merger review and how exactly we're going to do that, it depends on a number of things. In particular, it depends on the antitrust goals. Who is it that I'm trying to protect? What is this protection of competition that I'm talking about? Does that actually mean looking at consumer welfare standard? Does that mean potentially broaden our horizons and think about ecosystems that were mentioned here earlier, right? But it also depends on the quantitative tools that are available. And you know, we can get definitely more and more sophisticated tools, but then they get you run into a different argument, right? The more sophisticated a tool is, the less and less transparent it seems to be to somebody who is not necessarily well versed on all of those quantitative tools. And at the end of the day, this has to be a process that is at least understandable and reachable to everyone. We can also see that in the presence of efficiencies, HHI and purely concentrated-based measures may not be able to fully capture the gains in market power and or the likelihood to harm consumers. Well, if HHI doesn't take into consideration efficiencies whatsoever, then there's only one direction that HHI can show you, is that mergers are going to increase concentration, and therefore I can presume that there's going to be harm due to that. And moving to more structural-based models and unilateral effect estimates may be a better merger screening tool. Dutra and Somerville show that upward pricing pressure with efficiencies can give really accurate estimates in the presence of efficiencies. So yeah, I'm open to questions. I hope you enjoyed it.
So questions? So I will start out with a comment and a question. The comment is the sort of text analysis is interesting. You might think about sort of grouping sets of cases together and giving trends over time in a single portrayal. Rather, because it's sort of hard to tell what the changes were when you're looking at both individual cases and sort of each of them on their own sort of portrayal. And then the second is, and I think you kind of answered this at the end, but I haven't paid any attention to antitrust law much for 20 plus years, and I'm a little surprised HHI is still the measure. I mean, it's like, I sort of think this is like compared to baseball statistics, and I apologize for the sports analogy, right? But the sort of four-firm concentration ratio is batting average, and HHI is slugging percentage. And we're way beyond, they're way beyond that in that field. You got OPS, you got WAR, you got all these other things. And I'm surprised we're sort of, are there better measures of concentration out there that people use? Why? I mean, maybe it turns out that squaring the market shares is perfect and they got it right. And I assume there probably was testing of that up front, but anyway, I just was surprised, and I wondered if you could comment on alternative measures of concentration, or I mean, I guess what you're suggesting is maybe we shouldn't even look at concentration that way at all.
Concentration it still is a big part of merger review. It is still the very first thing that we calculate whenever we're going to submit something either to the Commission or to the Department of Justice. I'm now working on some electricity cases, and even to FERC, this is exactly what it is that I have to submit, is the HHI. But the key problem with HHI isn't the fact that we're squaring market shares and adding them up. It's the fact that the very first thing I have to do in order to determine market concentration is to define a market. And defining a market is so complicated. There is a lot of discretionary things that go into that. And yes, you have the small but significant non-transitory increase in price, and you can calculate your hypothetical monopolist test. But at the end of the day, you still depend on the quality of the data. You still depend on inherent assumptions that each of the experts are making. But as long as we cannot get away from the first thing that you do in any merger case is to determine what the market is, then you're still going to be running into the same kinds of problems.
Other questions? Yeah, Tom.
So you flirted, or at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about the Williamson model and consumer welfare standard versus the total welfare standard. And you probably saw that one of the commissioners, FTC commissioners, recently gave a speech sort of endorsing the total welfare standard, which honestly I'm kind of a fan of.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
The problem with moving away from consumer welfare standard, and I'd like to make very, very clear, I am also a really big fan of total welfare standard, is the fact that we don't really know we would have a dimensionality problem, right? Because as soon as you move in from looking at just consumers and now looking at everybody who's involved and everybody in society, then I need to come up with a whole new set of tools, and I'm going to be taking under consideration a lot more agents than I was taking simply under consumers, and this starts to get out of hand. So even if we look at the cases of both Canada and New Zealand, who have already formally adopted a total welfare standard, they start out with consumers. And then they're like, okay, now we're including one more set of agents and one more set of agents. So a lot that we have to do before we can confidently move on to a total welfare standard is to develop all the machinery that's going to be necessary to actually analyze a merger in this way. And on the other hand, we start losing some perspectives of maybe I still want to kind of give a little bit more weight to consumers than I would to total societal welfare, because firms can kind of take care of themselves. Consumers, they're a lot more fragile on that end. And how do you consolidate the idea of, yes, I'm still taking the rest of society into consideration, but I'm giving a little bit more weight to consumers than I would to firms or to other related parties and things like that. So I definitely think that the more research we do, the more we can start understanding and developing this machinery. But it is not something that we can adopt like, let's do a 2020 merger guidelines and now we're going to change to total welfare. Yeah.
I would make an argument, and I'm curious what you would think, that looking at efficiencies is actually contrary to looking at total welfare. A couple of examples of that would be a lot of times efficiencies can be achieved to the detriment of environmental standards or in terms of people losing their jobs. And there's a certain social benefit in full employment that goes contrary to efficiencies. Any comment on that observation?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of what I was mentioning before, is who gets included in this total welfare concept. Are we concerned with the fact that part of those efficiencies in reducing marginal cost means laying people off? Are we okay with that? And part of that, it could be that is slightly detrimental to environmental protection and things like that. So it basically goes to, we still need to understand what total welfare means. And there's definitely, on the vague definition, space for it to include the condition of the labor market, the ability of individuals to negotiate, and kind of going back to that bargaining issue, right? You have unions, you have big firms, and the big firms are getting more bargaining power vis-a-vis labor unions, and maybe this is not the type of bargaining power that we would like to include. So until we can formally define what exactly is going to be total welfare, how we're going to measure, and what is the actual machinery that's going to be used to estimate it, we can't say exactly which direction it would go.
Quick question. And then we'll
So you're focusing on, concentration sort of in the nitty-gritty, in the weeds of trying to resolve a case. Picking up on Chris's point, I would say that the debate has moved from going even, rather than going more fine-grained, like you're suggesting, it's actually becoming much more of a bird's-eye approach now, rather than even an HHI level. I mean, right now the rhetoric is all about, the Jason Furman type attitude that we don't look at market concentration, we look at industry concentration or sector concentration, and we should be really, really concerned about the fact that there are a whole range of areas of our markets that are concentrated in ways that they weren't before. And so, can you respond to that? Because I think it seems like the conversation is going in the other direction. You're saying go drill down even deeper to find market efficiencies, and I think that the conversation now is like, no, drill up and look at like not market concentration, but industry or sector concentration.
Yeah. So part of that is a little bit of what we were discussing in terms of total welfare, which is perhaps when I'm looking at consumer welfare, instead of looking at consumers in every particular market, I'm looking at the aggregate mass of consumers and saying, okay, for everybody who consumes this particular good, not necessarily in a local dimension, but they're being made better off. But perhaps there is one person in a small town in Kansas or one small group of consumers in one town in Kansas that's being harmed. Should that be the reason why we're blocking the whole merger? And again, that's where remedies come in and everything. But it still goes to what it is that antitrust is trying to defend or trying to protect. Is it the possibility that any group of consumers is going to be harmed whatsoever, or is it that the median or the mean consumer is going to be harmed?
Okay, let's thank Jessica.